Hi, I'm Joshua Pfeiffer.
Hi, I'm Meg.
Hi, I'm Chelsea.
And we are part of a group in the Lutheran Church called Lutherans for Life, and we're here today to talk about 10 ways Christians can positively respond to abortion. Okay, so we're here today to talk about the topic of abortion. And we know obviously this is can be a very tricky topic to talk about. It's very sensitive and it stimulates a lot of emotion for people for all sorts of reasons. But something that we feel we need to talk about, the statistics would tell us that 1 in 4 women in Australia have had an abortion, and this means that as Christians we know that this affects men and women in our churches, in our congregations, people sitting in our pews. And so what we particularly want to do in this video is think about how we as Christians can help cultivate and create a culture of life. How we can practically, positively respond to this reality of abortion. And we've got 10 ways that we're suggesting are a starting point for us to do this as Christians. Number 1 is over to Chelsea.
Okay, so number 1, creating a culture of life in the home. So this is where everything starts, doesn't it? Who are the people that God has given us to love and care for? Our spouses, our children, our parents, our siblings. What is life like for them? How do we interact with them? Do we respect them and love them as people who have been made in the image of God? Do we make time for them? Or are we all too caught up in what's going on in our own life? I know I'm tempted to do that sometimes, and you sort of get into a little bit of a vortex, but can we actually stop and enjoy time together? Make rituals, celebrate birthdays, make sure that our children feel like they're listened to. And I think this is especially important then when crises arrive in our life, that our children can feel that they can come to us and share the crises. So similarly, do we share our burdens with those around us? So if I'm going through a really difficult time, do I share that with a friend? So that if she in turn is having a really hard time in life, that she can share what's going on in her life? Or are we too proud and we put up barriers? Things like just serving our neighbours, getting to know them, delivering them meals from time to time, or just collecting their mail. All of this helps to build a culture of life and to ensure that we experience life as something joyful and not something to be feared.
And I think about this since having had my own children. I've thought about just how this this big issue in our society and in our church of abortion, how you respond to this within your own family then, and how you talk to your kids about the gift that life is, and about, as you say, okay, look, kids, you're old enough to see that this is not always easy for mum and dad, that we're struggling along with this, to be real about that. But we think life is a good thing, children are a good thing, marriage is a good thing, family life is a good thing. These are all gifts from God. It's not always easy, but we go through it together, we forgive each other as we go along, we continue to love each other, and just this cultivation of this sort of culture, even in our own families, I think, is one way that we actually practically and positively respond to this bigger issue that's out there of abortion.
Actually, because Meg and I were talking about this yesterday, I think a lot of people do have abortions because their experience of life was traumatic. Their home life was traumatic. And you hear people today saying, why would I bring a child into this world? I know people like that who have actually chosen not to have children because life is scary. And so I think, what can we do to ensure that life, as I said before, is experienced as a gift or as a joy, not something to be feared?
So that's number 1, encouraging a culture of life in the home. Number 2 on our list is encouraging a culture of life in our church, in our local congregation and that sort of thing. So I'm a pastor in a local church, and so this is something that is a responsibility, I guess, partly of my call to how you can encourage particular sorts of cultures in the life of a local church. And this is a really important one for me, is to think about, okay, the reality is we know that women have abortions for all sorts of reasons. There's really difficult things going on in their life. And what is it about the culture of even in our church, in our very own pews, that could actually be detrimental to people when they're thinking about going down this path? And I think it can be very simple things about the way that we respond to each other within the life of the church. Things like when a person announces a pregnancy. And so it's not uncommon now in our culture to have mixed responses sometimes when people announce a pregnancy, particularly if they're subsequent, not your first or second child and that sort of thing. And so just to celebrate these things, I think, in the life of the congregation, and to say, even if somebody, this is unexpected, to be able to say, look, I realise this could be hard, but we really rejoice with you that this is a new life that God's given you. And then I think about other really practical things that can happen in the life of the church, making meals for families when they have a new baby, just supporting them in this way, welcoming children and being tolerant of children in worship and this sort of thing. Perhaps you guys know better than I do. I don't sit in the pew with the kids that often, but sometimes parents with overly energetic children can get certain looks over the shoulder and that sort of thing in worship. That's right. And
I've always appreciated those lovely ladies who've come and sat with me in church, because I also haven't had someone sitting. My husband is also a pastor, and so I haven't had that supportive person there. And there have been women over the years, generally women, who've sat with me, and that's been so helpful.
And I know my wife had the same, and I can remember after one of the kids was born, particularly difficult, and just having this person. I don't think my wife even really had the energy necessarily to ask for this help, but the person just comes and just sits, and this whole culture of just welcoming children, welcoming life in these practical ways.
Having toys in the community spaces is a great idea.
That's true.
I think a lot of the things that churches do around, just even things like play groups and having groups for mums and kids in particular, all of these things, they cultivate this culture of life and this welcoming of life. And we don't necessarily always think about such little practical things like this as being a response to abortion. I think even having change facilities in a bathroom, these sorts of things, it's very simple, it's very practical, and in the big picture, these are ways we can respond to this reality of abortion positively. So that's number 2, encouraging a culture of life in our local churches. Number 3 on our list is the idea of promoting an annual Life Sunday. So in our circles in the Lutheran Church of Australia, I think this is something that probably hasn't happened a lot, but I know in other churches this is something that is quite common, that they'll have one Sunday a year where they'll particularly focus on life and the sanctity of life. And one suggestion has been that a good time to do this can be around the Festival of the Annunciation, March 25th. This is when we remember and celebrate.
It's a little dog that's coming to visit us.
Yeah.
This is our little friend scurrying around, but looks quite content now.
Yeah.
The Annunciation. It's March 25th, 9 months before Christmas, when we celebrate Jesus coming into the world in the womb of Mary. That this can be a good time to acknowledge the gift of life, particularly life in the womb, and to pray particularly for expectant mothers, for supporting fathers as well, of course, for those who have had abortions as well. And there are some good resources around prayers and these sorts of things that you can use for a Life Sunday. And Mother's and Father's Days can be a good times as well, and these things can come up in the life of the church. And so that's another practical thing that we can do, a Life Sunday in the life of the congregation. Number 4 on our list, I'm going to hand over to Meg.
Right, so for number 4, we're thinking about acknowledging miscarriage, stillbirth and abortions, so very sad experiences in people's lives, and thinking around how can we remember those or acknowledge that situation. So for my own personal experience, after we'd had 2 children, we were pregnant with the third, and I sensed that things weren't really progressing. My uterus felt really tight and smaller than I expected, and I sort of thought, usually by this stage I've felt some movement. So I went off to my 19-week scan thinking, I don't think things are quite right, and so I definitely made sure someone came with me, and sure enough, I actually think I said something to the radiologist before, I think something's wrong, so, so I knew it must be a very difficult thing for that person to have to deliver that news. So anyway, but what I guess I want to share about that is that through this experience there was a whole outpouring of love and care for my family in our church congregation, partly because with my husband as the pastor of the congregation, it was a very public situation. Everybody knew about how things turned out for us. And so we received so many cards, and our home was full of flowers. We received meals and so much care and love. But not only that, what was really significant was that we held a special ceremony for this little baby who was given to us. So I got to, see this little baby in such a small little thing, who we named Christopher. And we had a special burial memorial service for him a burial service at our church. And he's buried at our church in Box Hill in Melbourne. But what that led to was then a special memorial service later on in the year for all people in our congregation suffering from either miscarriage or stillbirth or abortion. And so, it was a service of psalms and music and just very healing and very bonding for our whole community to go through that.
It's a wonderful idea, and it connects obviously with the previous one about an annual Life Sunday is one way within the life of a church to acknowledge this whole issue, and this is another sort of one that grew up organically out of your experience, and my experience pastorally as well is that this is something that is far more common than is talked about in the life of the church, and it's so often not acknowledged. And so I think having these public acknowledgements can be so helpful and healthy for creating this culture of life in a community. So
And Christopher's buried at St Paul's.
That's right. Yes,
with a little plaque.
That's right. There's a plaque there, and I know that certainly one of the servers at communion, every time they take out the communion wine, they say a prayer, pour it around that area, and say a prayer for our little one, and it's very special.
Wow.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But I also just think of All Saints' Day in that context. So if there have been people in our congregations who've had a loss over the last year, that could be a really good time to acknowledge that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think another thing that makes me think about acknowledging when these things happen, both publicly and privately, is that there are things such as post-abortion retreats that happen. I know you're both aware of some of these, and that it's good for our churches at least to be aware of them, to refer people, not to try and sweep this under the rug and to pretend like it doesn't happen, but to acknowledge the reality of it, even though it's something that we can't affirm as a good path for people to go down. When it does happen, how do we care for people afterwards? And there are opportunities like that around.
That's right. I think most states would offer something. Maybe not all states.
I'm familiar with a group called Rachel's Vineyard. I actually had a friend who had an abortion, I think probably in her first year of university, and she really grieved the decision that she had made, and part of the healing process for her was going to one of these retreats, and apparently they go through a bit of a ceremony where she was able to name the baby, and also there's the retreat that she went on had a rite of confession and absolution as well.
Wow.
And so I think she found that really helpful in coming to terms with what had happened and sort of reconciling herself with God and finding forgiveness.
So that's number 4, acknowledging miscarriages and abortions in public and private. Number 5, Chelsea.
Yes, number 5 is drawing attention to the church's public teaching on abortion. So actually this is interesting to me at present because not long ago I had a conversation with a girl at church, and we've been talking about the abortion debate, and she offered an opinion that was her own, and I think there is a lot of diversity within the church on the issue of abortion. People will say things like, I wouldn't have one for myself, but I think they should be available, and this sort of thing. We're a diverse group in the Lutheran Church. Nevertheless, our church isn't silent on the question of abortion, and many people aren't aware that there is actually a public statement. It's a doctrinal statement and theological opinion, so it comes under the bracket of DSTO statements. So our church has actually formulated a statement on abortion, and I think it's really important that people within the Lutheran Church access these statements, because whilst we might have our own individual opinions on these issues, as Christians we don't think individually. We think as a church. We're informed by Scripture, we're informed by what the church teaches us. And so I'd recommend everybody watching this video to go to either the LCA webpage and look under the doctrinal statement section and abortion, but you can also access it through the Lutherans for Life website, which is...
Well, we'll put links to all of those things down in the description below in case we get it wrong now.
Oh, okay. I won't attempt it then. But we have links to the statements as well. And I think it's just good to see what the church is saying, to try and digest it. And it can be a great resource for pastors as well, or small groups to discuss and reflect on the public teaching in the LCA.
Thanks, Chelsea. So that was number 5, drawing attention to the existence of the church's public teaching. And then number 6, Meg.
Yep, well, leading on from that, certainly we've got some teaching that we would love on our website that we'd love young people, youth and young adults to access. So encouraging the idea that you could use resources to teach about life, to teach about the gift of life with even younger people. So I guess it leads me to think about Bible study, youth studies, but also things like introducing children to fetal models or thinking about themselves when they are inside the womb. All sorts of things that you can do to just draw attention to life being a gift, our own life being a gift. It
makes me think about how I've seen some analysis or statistics about various times at which abortion has actually, reduced slightly in particular areas, and one of the things that some people, think it's connected to is just the advanced technology to do with sonograms and being able to actually see unborn children and these sorts of things, that actually we can have all of the arguments in the world when it comes to abortion, but actually the experience and being educated and actually seeing what this life is inside you can be one of the most powerful things.
And hearing the heartbeat of your child for the first time, those sorts of things are so very special. Yeah, so imparting some of that specialness to our young people is
particularly young people. Yeah, I've got to say that heartbeat thing is I will never forget that moment. I knew about a little bit about biology, and I had some convictions about the topic of abortion already, but I'll never forget hearing the heartbeat of my first child and just thinking, okay, this has all just changed. I can't even quite articulate to this day exactly how, but it's just different from then on.
Okay, so I guess we also think about sex ed in our schools. Sometimes I'm not sure parents are really sure about what our children are being taught in schools. I'd suggest to parents it's a really good idea for you to find out about what your schools are teaching your children. do you like the message that they're passing on? Do you think it's a good program? And then, you know, I know some parents might make the decision to remove their children from the sex ed that's being provided at their school, because I'm sure in many circumstances parents have a great message to pass on to their children. Maybe in our culture it's not necessarily something that's easily spoken about in the home, but I think it's a really great idea for parents to pass on the message of the complementarity of the sexes, God's design for marriage and for children, and how we receive children as a gift, all these sorts of ideas. But then, of course, there are some initiatives, there are some sex educators out there that are actually really quality. And so some schools do bring out outside programs that are I would suggest are really great. They're update. What's the word? I don't know. Like they're contemporary. Yeah, that's right.
And accessible format and that sort of thing. Yeah.
But then I guess the issue as well is whether you're in a state school or a private school. Private schools are more likely to bring in Christian content, or something that aligns with Christian teaching a bit more. So it's a very tricky area. So I just encourage people to know what their children are being taught and to look into that. On our website, we do have some suggestions for different groups around the country. Any other?
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful, and this, you know, again, just thinking in the bigger picture that the issue of abortion, it arises out of a whole context, a whole worldview to do with sexuality and life, and so we need to be thinking right back into young people's educational times about the sorts of messages that are being sent, even if they're not directly about abortion at this stage. I think it's often, it can be ploughing the field for a worldview that opens one up to this more, so...
Yeah, absolutely, because I think also a lot of these secular sex ed programs seem to have promote safe sex as the way to educate young people today. But if you look at abortion statistics, we know that, contraception is not 100% effective.
Yeah.
And abortion statistics tell us that I think it's something as high as 60% of people who have abortions were using contraception at the time.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of these secular sex ed groups think that if children are contracepting, then abortions won't happen. But I think that's a bit of a furphy.
Very good. So that is number 6, developing or supporting educational opportunities for youth and young adults. Number 7 is over to Meg as well.
All right. So number 7 is supporting pregnancy and post-birth support services. So with with number 7, I think about firstly our financial support, our prayer support for places that support women in crisis pregnancy and unplanned pregnancies. So again, I would say probably every single state or territory around our nation would have places, often run by volunteers. They're often not-for-profit. I think when I think about one particular one, I'll just take, for example, one here in Adelaide. They have an ultrasound machine so that you can hear a child's, so you can see and hear your child's heartbeat. They have counselling on the phone or in person. They can offer material assistance, so they can offer clothes, cots, car seats, all sorts of things. I'm not sure about financial assistance, but all sorts of things like playgroups for single mothers or very young mothers. Developing retreats for learning how to parent well, all sorts of things that they offer. So we could get involved in those things as volunteers. We could offer our financial support to those groups, prayer support, and things like that.
So that's number 7, supporting pregnancy and post-birth support agencies. Number 8 is over to Chelsea.
Okay, so number 8 is advocating for the unborn and the vulnerable. I think as Christians we can get engaged in public debates about abortion. So what's happening in our parliaments? Is there any legislation that's been introduced that might affect the lives of the unborn or those who are vulnerable, people with disabilities, single mothers, this sort of thing? And I think it's great to engage in these debates, to figure out what is being discussed, to understand how this policy might affect children in the womb and those that I've just mentioned before. You can write letters to your members of parliament if you're concerned about the legislation that's being proposed, making meetings to speak with them. I think people often feel ill-equipped, and they'll feel like, well, I wasn't trained as a lawyer, I'm not a doctor, and so I don't really know all of the arguments. But I think parliamentarians also need to hear from mothers at home, fathers at home, people in their day-to-day vocations. They're there to represent us. We live in a democracy, and they need to hear our response to these things. If you can have a researched approach to these issues, even better, and help the parliamentarians in their job, provide them with evidence to help them make good public policy, that's fantastic too. Another thing I would say is engaging in the media. So writing letters to the editor. If you read something in the paper that you just think is not quite right, doesn't sit well with you, it can be a matter of sharing your story with the media as well. So women who have experienced abortion grief, or they've carried a child with a disability to term and want to share what happened as a result of that. Perhaps the baby died in their arms a few hours later, or perhaps that child has gone on to flourish and the diagnosis wasn't quite correct. Sharing these stories in the media to actually promote life and to give testament to the fact that women do suffer as a result of abortions, we know that, but also that life in the womb and all life, including people with disabilities, are precious and deserving of dignity and our respect.
Yeah.
And so, Chelsea, I know as you talk about these things, I'm aware that there's a particular journey for you and your family that gives you a certain passion, and I was just wondering if you can share your own personal story that sort of feeds into some of these issues as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, I can't remember exactly how old I was. I think I might have been about 12. I always loved rummaging through my mum's things. My mum doesn't throw much out, so she keeps all of her old bridesmaid dresses, and she keeps old letters and all sorts of old diaries, and she would let me sort of rifle through them. And one day I stumbled across a little newspaper clipping, which I meant to bring today, but I forgot. And it was a letter that she had written into The Age, that's a newspaper in Melbourne, and it was entitled, "I Wouldn't Give Him Up for the World." And in it, she just explained that at 30 weeks gestation, her third child, that's my brother, was diagnosed with a severe brain abnormality. So half of his brain was missing. He had something called hydrocephalus, so fluid on the brain. And she explains how the outcome appeared very grim. But she carried my brother to term and delivered him, and he was beautiful. He was a really beautiful baby, and she says even now he looked perfect. And I said to her, "Why did you write this into the Age? Why would you share this story?" And apparently at the time there was a public debate about late-term abortion because a woman had undergone an abortion because her child was diagnosed with suspected dwarfism. And it turns out that the child was aborted, but probably not a dwarf anyway. So my mum shared this with me, and I think it was a really strong witness of advocacy. And I would have been 4 when my brother was born, and he was just my brother. I mean, he had his disabilities, cerebral palsy, a mild intellectual disability, but we didn't really think of him that way. We just loved him. And so that really struck home for me, the reality of abortion and what that could have meant for my brother.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I'm grateful to my mum for her witness and her example in writing that letter, and that's an example of the sort of witness that we can be in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Chelsea.
So, Chelsea, I also think about how we can be welcoming in our churches, or other ways that we can advocate for people with disabilities, celebrate their lives, celebrate them being amongst us as part of God's good creation. Do you have any ideas around that?
Well, actually, what immediately comes to mind is my experience in church growing up. We had a few people with severe disabilities. They were wheelchair bound. And there was a particular man there, and I know he would pick up this woman in a wheelchair every week and bring her to church and feed her with a straw. Right. And it was a messy job. I think the food must have been processed. But I thought that was a beautiful witness of how we can sort of lay down our lives for those in our community.
Right.
Other things, I think, are probably more along the lines of just being accommodating for people with disabilities if they are to make noise in the service. Yeah. So at one of the churches that we frequent here in Adelaide, there's a woman with a disability who likes to make these sort of noises during the service. And I think it's nice to sort of view them as worshipful. Like at times she raises her arms and go, and I actually think, what is she seeing here? And maybe she's seeing things that we can't see. And just to be accommodating and encouraging of people like that and their carers as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great. I'm glad we brought this theme in, particularly about welcoming those with disabilities as a really important way to build this culture of life in our community, particularly in our churches. So that was all under number 8, advocating for the unborn and the vulnerable. Number 9 is about praying as a church and praying as individuals. One of the things I think that I've realised over many years of thinking about this issue, reading and interacting with people, is that it's far deeper than most of us realise, the issue of abortion. There are surface level issues going on, and often I think the discussion in our society is around these sort of surface level things and trying to provide certain services that can help and all this sort of stuff. But for me, I really see a deep spiritual battle going on for women and men considering abortion, and that just immediately makes me realise I'm actually quite limited, humanly speaking, in how I can help. All of this stuff is great. We're called to all of this sort of stuff, but as Christians, we do have one resource that goes deeper even, and that's the resource of prayer. I think, and I think praying for sort of, in my mind, is something that weaves in and out and over and under, if you like, all of this other stuff. And so, yes, provide play groups for the new parents, provide welcoming opportunities for those with disabilities and all the things we've talked about. And then also remember as a church to pray for these people, to pray for those who are experiencing unexpected pregnancies, to pray for those who are considering abortion, to pray for those who are struggling as new parents. And I think this is something we're called to personally, privately, but I think as a church too, in the scriptures, I think we're called to pray as a community, and we're told that this is actually something different, it's something powerful, and to join our hearts and minds together as a community in prayer. I've experienced this myself. One place where abortion does come up in our own Lutheran Church of Australia worship resources is actually on Mother's Day, and there's this beautiful prayer, and it prays for mothers in all sorts of situations, and then it also prays for mothers who have had an abortion. And every single time I've used this prayer, people will come up and talk about it. And it's, again, it's a little bit hard to sort of explain exactly what's going on there, but it's just something about it. Prayer is something really powerful. And so we'd encourage all Christians to pray about this issue of abortion in all sorts of ways and all sorts of dimensions.
I also think of praying for our leaders, praying for our members of parliament, and for good rule in our country.
Right.
Yeah, so
That's
I
right.
think that's a really important one.
That's a great point, Meg. You know, you think in the New Testament, there's not a whole lot about how Christians are to interact with the governing authorities, but one thing that's very clear is that we're called to pray for them as our first thing.
Yeah.
And they appreciate it too.
Right.
Yeah, so there's a big debate going on at the moment here in South Australia, and I know a few politicians who are very grateful for the prayers that they've been receiving. So it's tiring work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
And relentless.
That's right. So number 9, pray as a church and as individuals. That brings us to number 10. You've done well if you made it this far through the video. This is our last one, and it's simply to preach the gospel, to make disciples, and as part of that to teach our true identity as Christians. It's interesting, when we were preparing this all comes out of a paper that we wrote together, and we were thinking about this issue. And I think this point, it became especially important for me as a concluding thought, because I realised that, again, one of my reflections on thinking about this for many years now is that there is this deep connection between receiving life from God and receiving eternal life from God. I think that these things are actually spiritually connected, and that there is a very real sense in which all of our convictions about this issue of abortion, they actually come out of our Christian identity. They come out of our faith in God, our trust in God, that we are open to receiving all good things from Him, even when it's difficult, even when it involves suffering. And so there's a sense in which, although I'm always happy to talk to a non-Christian about something like an abortion, and to engage with our secular leaders with arguments about this issue that I think are accessible to all people, non-Christian arguments, there's another sense in which I think the true solution, if you like, to this issue of abortion is actually doing what we're called to do as a church, to preach the gospel, to ask God to change hearts and open people up to Him in every way. And as a part of this, there is then an opening to life, literally life, even in our own families. And another really significant part of this work is that is finding our true identity in Christ.
Yeah, it's a big one.
I know this is something that's Meg, you like to talk about, and I've found your reflections on this helpful as well. That one of the things that really is challenging about the issue of an unexpected pregnancy, I think, is it brings up issues of our identity. Who are we, and where are our greatest values in life? Things like, or is my identity as a person who is going to have a successful career? Well, this is going to possibly throw that into a bit of chaos.
Yeah.
Or is my identity in, all sorts of other things. Now, when my identity is in Christ, and there's a security there, and there's a peace in that, then it's not just an unexpected pregnancy that I can then cope with, or even eventually rejoice in. It's anything. It's all sorts of things, right?
I also think that, focusing on who Christ is, who we are in Christ, also helps us to not to fall into despair when we think about, there are 80 to 90,000 abortions happening around Australia. Or sorry, let me get that correct.
Well, estimated it was 70 to 90. It's an estimated figure, 1,000 per year nationally in Australia.
Right. And so as we can really easily fall into despair when you think about those sorts of numbers. And I think when we turn our eyes away from our worldly woes and think about our true identity and just focus on God as sovereign. And
I was just going to say, and I think also if we experience unexpected pregnancy or a crisis pregnancy, that recognition that God is the author of life, He's given life to us.
Yeah.
This life is a gift. Because I think in our culture today we sort of slip into thinking, oh, it's about our choice. Life is a choice. Do I want to be a mother yet? Am I ready to be a mother yet or a father yet? But when your identity is grounded in Christ, that sense that all life comes from him and all life is a gift. And that can give us courage.
Yeah.
You know, when you're feeling sick and you're throwing up with morning sickness and the timing feels all wrong, that this is God ordained. Yeah.
And I remember speaking to another person in sort of the circles that work in this area of abortion, a person who is pro-life, to use that terminology, and they were talking about someone in their own family who was quite vigorously on the other side of this debate than they were. And I was just very impressed with this person's clarity on this particular point, because they were saying to me, look, they have all these discussions and arguments, but they said, this person whom I love dearly, their biggest problem is not that they're in favour of abortion. They said the biggest thing is that they don't actually know Jesus Christ. They don't actually have faith in Jesus Christ. And that's what this person prayed for more than anything. That's what this person hoped for. And they trusted that actually as God gives this person, opens this person up to the gift of salvation because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, that then this openness to life would come as a part of the life that flows from that. So.
Meg, I think you should show everyone what you have on your lap.
Yes, so you've been hearing the sounds of pitter-patter on the floor. This is Coco, isn't she a honey? So she's been running around on the floor, and now she's having a nice little rest on my lap. So hope you enjoyed those extra sounds.
So thanks for watching. Those are our 10 ways that Christians can positively respond to the issue of abortion. God bless you guys, and God bless you. See you later.
See ya.
Bye.